So, dear Thầy, dear Sangha, welcome to the presentation of the 5 Mindfulness training. Today is September 7, year 2023. We are at the Rising Tide meditation hall at the Magnolia Grove Monastery. And tonight we have 5 wonderful volunteers who volunteered to present to us their experience of the practice of the 5 Mindfulness training. And often we say that, well, we come to the monastery and we encourage to practice mindfulness, but how do we deal when different situations, when we go back to work, when we go back to family, when we travel, and what are some concrete methods of practicing? So the 5 Mindfulness training, which you have in your hand here, are very concrete way to practice mindfulness in daily life. And the one thing I need to know that we're all practicing. So the lay friend, all the interbeing member, the novice, monks and nuns, the lay Dharma teacher, the monastic Dharma teacher, we all practicing the 5 Mindfulness training. We might receive some other training from the monastic point of view, but we still, the basis is still the 5 Mindfulness training. And it gives us a general direction to go in a direction of love, kindness, compassion, and bring us joy and happiness. And it also like a security bell, like when you drive, it prevents us from getting into trouble. And we will never practice perfectly the 5 Mindfulness training. Thầy say that it's like going to the direction of the North Star. So we know we go in that direction, but we will never reach the North Star because apparently it's another planet somewhere very far. But that's a good direction to go, and it feels good in your heart, it feels good in your body. The wording resonates with what your idea, what you want to become. So I think that's a good idea. So in general, I just want to say to you the general before the 5 person will make a presentation. If you notice, you're reading the wording. When I first received, it was very short. It was like, I don't know, 20 years ago or more. And then every year we add up a little bit more just to make it more up to date with the society, trend and so on. So you notice there are 3 parts. The first part is aware of the suffering because of that, and each training is different. So I will refrain from doing something because it might cause a suffering. And then the second layer after that is they're aware of interconnected with everything. So not only I refrain from doing that, but also I will speak out. I will make a more positive action to prevent others from doing that or to help other people from not doing that. And the last part is even more action, is you become more proactive. You become surrogate for the weak, for the disadvantaged, and you try to change the system. You do something like that. So in each of the words, they use a different wording for each of the training, but basically that's the idea. So they have a 3 part into that. That's why the wording is so long. So without taking too much time, I would like to maybe invite the first person to share the first mindfulness training. So let me present to you. I think this David Flynn from New York City, New York State. He is a good friend of mine, even before I receive a five mindfulness training and before I become a monk. And that gold roof, he's gonna present the second mindfulness training, and Miss Nguyễn Phượng, she's gonna present the third mindfulness training. Very hot topics. And Sue Ellen, he's going to present the fourth mindfulness training. And Rachel Perry going to present the fifth mindfulness training. So they will read the mindfulness training first, and they have about 7 to 8 minutes to share. So if sister, when the come time to the 7 minutes, if you can do the half bell, just remind the person to wrap up the sharing. Thank you. So maybe we listen to one sound of the bell first before you. Yeah.
The first mindfulness training, reverence for life. Aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, I am committed to cultivating the insight of interbeing and compassion and learning ways to protect the lives of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I am determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to support any act of killing in the world, in my thinking, or in my way of life. Seeing that harmful actions arise from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance, which in turn come from dualistic and discriminative thinking, I will cultivate openness, non-discrimination, and non-attachment to views in order to transform violence, fanaticism, and dogmatism in myself and in the world. So aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life. What about right now? As Sister D had said in the morning, I mean, are we destroying life right now through inattention, lack of awareness, whether it's to ourselves, to all of this, to anything? Because in this kind of moment-to-moment mindfulness or awareness, whether we do it or not, lie the seeds or roots of deeper insight into compassion and interbeing. So again, I would just ask all of us, are we killing life right now, or are we present? And present does not mean a good feeling or happy all the time. It just means present. And with that present from Sister D, I'm going to share just a couple words about my own practice, in particular around giving up the eating of meat. And just to be clear, the training asks for a direction. It does not require a commitment to being a vegetarian in order to receive it. But sometime 30 plus years ago, I was approaching Buddhist teachings, and for other reasons I really don't remember anymore, it became clear to me that animals wish to live as much as I do. I don't come from that background, but it was an insight that had many causes over a number of years, but that made it very easy first to stop eating meat, and not for health reasons, honestly. Probably still don't eat in a very healthy way, though I'm a vegetarian. And then working my way down or up the food chain to fish and shellfish. And my main point is that through the looking and seeing the suffering, touching that, it became relatively easy to give those things up. Other than through example, I don't make efforts to try to stop other people, from what they eat or choose to eat, but I'm always happy to discuss these things, and I hope in a skillful way. All of that applies to any kind of consumption. The Buddha, there's a title of a sutra called the Sun's Flesh Sutra, and it's a very powerful, you could say violent metaphor, that consumption, there's a tragedy of life, which is life requires life to survive, literally to eat, and that there's a way where we're eating our children's flesh. And it's a metaphor, but it's meant to really help wake us up. And I encourage all of us, whether it's news taken in for the good purpose of being informed, or whether it's what we eat, to really reflect on what seeds we're watering in the mind and the body. I'm going to, I guess, two more things. Non-attachment to views, certainly important in our interactions and certainly in the world. I don't have a political program here to end the war in Ukraine. But I can tell you from the point of view of our teachings, we have to start a little deeper than that and a little before that. And it's not the personal before the political viewpoint of that college-style debate, but that we collectively do have to transform the seeds of violence and hatred and identification in a harmful way, whether it's with nation, family, group, and I think that's enough, but I want to thank my brother and thank all of us here together.
Dear teacher, dear beloved community, my name is Gaurav. I'm going to be presenting the second mindfulness training, True Happiness. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I am committed to practicing generosity in my thinking, speaking, and acting. I am determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. And I will share my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in need. I will practice looking deeply to see that the happiness and suffering of others are not separate from my own happiness and suffering. That true happiness is not possible without understanding and compassion. And that running after wealth, fame, power, and sensual pleasures can bring much suffering and despair. I'm aware that happiness depends on my mental attitude and not on external conditions, and that I can live happily in the present moment simply by remembering that I already have more than enough conditions to be happy. I am committed to practicing right livelihood so that I can help reduce the suffering of living beings on Earth and stop contributing to climate change. So the mindfulness trainings are very special to me. I received them last year, actually, at the first anniversary of my mom's death at the retreat, How to Live When a Loved One Dies. By that time, I was already on the path for a few years. I had been coming to the monastery, and I knew I was ready to receive them and to practice these trainings. I moved to the US approximately 10 years, 11 years ago, and I got a lot of success quite early on, thankfully. But at the same time, I left a community behind, and then I kept moving within the US. So with that came a sense of loneliness, and also, this success, I realized the happiness that I got from that was short-lived. It was not a true contentment or happiness that goes along with how if you aim to achieve something and the kind of happiness you're expected to get from it. So this second training has very deep meaning for me, and especially the part I like is that the happiness depends on my mental attitude and not on external conditions. It took few years for me to learn this, and I was constantly looking for happiness outside. And I learned through these trainings and through the teachings, through the Buddhist teachings, that it is very true that it depends on my own attitude as well. And on top of that, so another thing that it helps me, so I'm an oncologist, so another important thing is sometimes, as physicians, we try to push away our patient suffering as other and not our own. So it also helps me take better care of my patients to realize that their suffering is not separate from my own. So I now have a reminder set on my calendar to go every few weeks, recurrent basis, that reminds me, in our busy schedule to go through these trainings. And it's always very grounding. Every time I read them, it really it reminds me of a lot of things every time I take something new from them. As you can see, it's quite dense, but the main message from the second training for me really is that happiness is not dependent on external factors, and second is we are not separate from others. Thank you.
So I will be reading the third mindfulness training called True Love. Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I am committed to cultivating responsibility and learning ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. Knowing that sexual desire is not love, and that sexual activity motivated by craving always harms myself as well as others. I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without mutual consent, true love, and a deep, long-term commitment. I resolve to find spiritual support for the integrity of my relationship from family members, friends, and Sangha with whom there is support and trust. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. Seeing that body and mind are interrelated, I am committed to learn appropriate ways to take care of my sexual energy and to cultivate the 4 basic elements of true love: loving kindness, compassion, joy, and inclusiveness, for the greater happiness of myself and others. Recognizing the diversity of human experience, I am committed not to discriminate against any form of gender identity or sexual orientation. Practicing true love, we know that we will continue beautifully into the future. So, I got the hardest one, I see. I am grateful because I think this is where we can have the more meaningful conversations when we're being frank and courageous. So I invite us all to bring that spirit. A little bit about myself before I speak to this training. My name is Phuong, and I was born in Montreal, Canada, and I moved here about 10 years ago. And most of my background is in social justice work, but now I just finished certification for health and wellness coaching, and I've done some wellness work as well for the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. So I'm grateful to be here among people who are healers and caregivers and healthcare providers, because I do believe this theme speaks about a place that's very tender, that's very vulnerable. And earlier today in the Dharma talk, we talked about unresolved issues, unresolved wounds. And in my experience, I've been able to observe a lot of this. The experience I will talk about is a professional one, and it was at the University of Memphis, where I was a compliance officer, and I was investigating sexual misconduct. So that was my work. I was assigned when cases went wrong, when there was an issue with students or faculty or staff where someone was harassed or someone was sexually assaulted, and somebody had to investigate the facts and figure out what the resolution was. And in that work, what I found was people who were trying to fill a void, right? Trying to act on cravings that they believe fed a wound or an unresolved issue from childhood that created further harm, that created further violence and hurt among people, among students, among faculty members. And it was a pretty widespread issue. And part of my work and part of my practice in trying to bring the values and the ethics of true love into my work was to educate people without judgment and learning how to speak to people about what consent means, what healthy relationship means, and what love truly means when we integrate that into our actions, into our behaviors, into conscious decisions and choices that we make. And so a lot of us are led by some of these wounds, and I've seen that happen, and I've seen the traumatic effect, and I've seen how we have grown to be adults who carry some traumas from childhood. And so a lot of my workshops when I was not investigating was educating people on this particular word, mutual consent, and trying to understand how do we really live by that? How do we invite that for ourselves? And how do we ascertain that from people, right? How do we make sure whenever we engage, it is an empowered, consented form of engagement? And I will leave you all with this because I can speak for hours on this. But the one thing that I try to still embody for myself and for others and for my daughter who is 9 years old is understanding and being aware of our bodies and understanding what does feel healthy, what does feel good. And part of what we're doing today is that, right? Nourishing ourselves and taking care of others along the way. And the first step is having that relationship to your body and understanding when you're consenting to an act, is this truly nourishing? Is this truly healthy? Is it a reflection and a manifestation of true love? So I invite you all to think about the tenets that we talked about. And when we think about consent, really understanding that it's both ways. And the more that I am in relationship with myself and my body and honoring that, the more I can live up to this third tenet and third mindfulness training that can become more intuitive the more we are healed and the more we're in our bodies. Thank you.
The fourth mindfulness training, loving speech and deep listening. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others, I am committed to cultivate loving speech and compassionate listening in order to relieve suffering and to promote reconciliation and peace in myself and among other people, ethnic and religious groups, and nations. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I am committed to speaking truthfully, using words that inspire confidence, joy, and hope. When anger is manifesting in me, I am determined not to speak. I will practice mindful breathing and walking in order to recognize and to look deeply into my anger. I know that the roots of anger can be found in my wrong perceptions and lack of understanding of the suffering in myself and in the other person. I will speak and listen in a way that can help myself and the other person to transform suffering and see the way out of difficult situations. I am determined not to spread views that I do not know to be certain and not to utter words that can cause division or discord. I will practice right diligence to nourish my capacity for understanding, love, joy, and inclusiveness, and gradually transform anger, violence, and fear that lie deep in my consciousness. Dear Thai, dear Sangha, my name is Sue Ellen, and I come from the unceded territories of the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe. Today, it's known as Chicago in the Midwest. I come from a blue enclave, and blue meaning progressive politics. And the story I want to tell you in my practice today is not about how I practice this with emails and stopping before I send a text in my professional work as a therapist and an educator, but with my family. I have a blue sister-in-law and I have a red sister-in-law. And what that means is I have a sister-in-law that embraces progressive politics and one conservative politics. About 10 years ago, I saw kind of the verbal sparring come to the point where I thought there would be fisticuffs. And I love both of these women dearly, dearly, dearly. During the pandemic, I went to visit my red sister-in-law to check in because my brother is in advanced stages of Parkinson's. He had a stroke around 12 years ago and never really regained his speech. I was in the kitchen talking with her and asking her how it's going, and she is in the early stages of dementia, so the stress of caregiving and dementia also is leading her to the point of skipping from one subject to another, but I follow. I was asking her how it was going, and she said, oh, the same. She said, I was wondering something. One of my favorite anchors on Fox News, which she had been listening to for about 25 years, is gone. I don't know, do you know what happened to him? And this was an anchor that was taken off the air because of a sexual harassment case and a big payout, which happens in all progressive and conservative news media outlets. And I knew about it, but I said, why do you ask? She said, well, because I just kind of miss watching him. And I thought for a second, There was something about in the desperation and the imminent kind of fear in her eyes. And I said, well, I'm not sure where he's producing from, but let's get your iPad and I can show you how to find him on YouTube, because that's where, when you've done some bad stuff on media, you end up with your own channel on YouTube. So I show her how to find YouTube, how to go on, oh, thank you so much. And she looked at me, and there were tears in her eyes, and she spontaneously hugged me, said, thank you so much. And I knew at that moment it wasn't about, well, I won't say his name, just guess. It wasn't about him. It was about all the changes and all the loss and the imminent knowledge that she knew my brother would be placed in assisted living soon, and where he is now. And each day we're waiting for the notice that it is now hospice. So it was really responding to a nonverbal deep listening of what I felt in the moment, in my body, using my body, my senses, and to really transcend my own political ideology to what would make her feel safe and whole again, however momentarily that was. So I called my friends afterward and I said, you're not going to believe what I did. What? And I recounted the experience, and you did what? And I'm like, yeah. And it's like, don't they relegate those people to parts of the internet that they don't, like, they're trying to banish folks like that from the internet? And I said, I know. And then my friend who knows me well and knows that I've taken these trainings said, I know you did the right thing. How did it make her feel? She was safe. She was happy for a moment. She was secure. And she needed that sense of reassurance that something is constant. So it's a little different twist on loving speech. I took the trainings 20 years ago, and certainly we talked about loving speech differently than we are now. And I just offer this to you because I think it's relevant to how we're living today. And I just want to say, despite ideology that's being spewed, in my heart of hearts, practicing in this way, I know that love always, always, always transcends hate and bigotry and sexism and any other ethnic disparagement, class disparagement you can name. Thank you.
Hi. The fifth training, nourishment and healing. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I am committed to cultivating good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. I will practice looking deeply into how I consume the 4 kinds of nutriments, namely edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. I am determined not to gamble or to use alcohol, drugs, or any other products which contain toxins, such as certain websites, electronic games, TV programs, films, magazines, books, and conversations. I will practice coming back to the present moment to be in touch with the refreshing, healing, and nourishing elements in me and around me, not letting regrets and sorrow drag me back into the past, nor letting anxieties, fear, or craving pull me out of the present moment. I am determined not to try to cover up loneliness, anxiety, or other suffering by losing myself in consumption. I will contemplate interbeing and consume in a way that preserves peace, joy, and well-being in my body and consciousness, and in the collective body and consciousness of my family, my society, and the earth. My name is Rachel, and I took these trainings about 4.5 years ago. And at first, when I wasn't sure if I was going to take the trainings, because I was sort of thinking of them in my mind as like commandments, you know. And then this metaphor for the North Star, and you know, having something, a goal, and having concrete ways to help me be aware of my actions was really helpful. And so with this training, I first really started looking at edible nutriments, you know, food. And I thought, well, why am I eating things that I know are unhealthy, you know? And how does it make me feel when I am eating these things? And I did end up, some of my answers were sometimes it's habit, sometimes it has to do with just what's going on around me. You know, everybody's eating birthday cake, so I'm gonna have some birthday cake. Or and I ended up you know, changing the way that I ate, but also it was not even just what I was eating, but how I was consuming it. You know, I've realized that when I slow down and pay attention to what I'm eating, that, you know, I don't feel as sick afterwards because I'm not inhaling it, you know. And then I started really paying attention to sense impressions, like how much news I was consuming and how it was affecting me and making me really anxious. And you know, one of the first things I did was, you know, I looked around for sources of news where there weren't inciting headlines, and, you know, or less so, and less graphic pictures and so on. And you know, I wanted to stay aware of what's going on, but I also realized that it was just upping my anxiety. And yeah, I actually noticed my husband watches less news now too, so. But, and then what's really, I wanted to mention, I realized that conversations, you know, it mentions conversations, and I realized that, wow, yeah, I mean, I had this like habit energy of complaining, and I had friends who had habit energy of complaining, and talking about, you know, comparing things, and, you know, talking, you know, when I realized I didn't want to participate in gossiping, and, you know, it became difficult because, you know, some of my friends, you know, once we got past the kids being the same, you know, raising the kids together, there was more conversations about, you know, beauty and, you know, material consumption, and things that I was starting to realize were not like the main things that I wanted to be talking to people about. And then even at work, you know, I'm a physician, and you know, I realized there's a lot of talk that goes on, you know, with the techs and physicians about, you know, kind of complaining about patients in a really kind of negative way and really coloring the way that we look at the world. And so I ended up like really kind of separating myself and taking myself out of these situations, and it became kind of uncomfortable. I have, you know, old friends that I just didn't feel like I could spend as much time with because it became overwhelming. And I made a lot of new friends, you know, with practice, but, you know, also just starting to realize what my, you know, values were at that point. But anyway, what I wanted to get to is that at this point, I think I've realized that I'm starting to realize when I've had enough. And so I'm learning to set boundaries. And you know, a couple weeks ago, we went to a party with these old friends, and I realized like there's just so much suffering, and I saw all the suffering coming out, you know, and just, you know, comparing about trips they take and, you know, clothes that they want to get and all the, you know, plastic surgery or whatever, you know, and when I'm feeling more solid, I can see that suffering, and I can see the parts that I love in those people, and my conversations become more skillful. And I think it's because I was afraid to talk about or to talk to these people because I was afraid of them touching these negative seeds in me, you know? And I think that now that I'm recognizing these seeds and that when they get touched, they do grow. And, but my practice, you know, helps me to have healthy boundaries and remember to find my breath. And so, yeah, I guess that's about it. Thank you.
So you can listen to one sound of the bell first. So, dear Thầy, dear Sangha, thank you for the 5 panelists for sharing how they practice the 5 mindfulness training. It looked like we end earlier than expected, so we have about an hour for you to ask a question to the panelists. But before you ask question, let me ask you a question too. How many people here are not familiar with the 5 mindfulness training or have not received 5 mindfulness training? Can you raise your hand? Okay, a lot of new people. Yeah, yes. So this Saturday morning, you will have a chance to receive the 5 mindfulness training. The ceremony is earlier this year on a Saturday instead of Sunday, at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. So usually you read the wording of the 5 mindfulness training and you feel draw toward that. You feel that that's the ideal reflect what your heart is thinking about it. And then you make a wish to receive it in front of the Sangha to give support. So in other words, sometimes we call it transmission, but actually we give a collective energy of the whole Sangha, the monks and nuns and everything. But actually, the 5 months training you already have in your heart. It's just an encouragement for you to go in that direction. So one thing is you have to think about which mindfulness training you're more comfortable with. Some mindfulness training you think, well, I'm thinking about it, but maybe I might not be perfect in practicing. So you might refrain from receiving, for example. So you can choose an option of receive the first one, maybe a third one, maybe the fourth one, or maybe the fifth one only, or maybe any combination, the second and the fourth, or something like that. So any combination is good, or you can opt to receive all 5. And many friends also receive maybe 1 or 2 first, and then later on they will renew their commitment and add the other one later on. So the option is there for you to make a choice about which direction you want to go. And also there is a part when you write your wish in some of the reason why you want to receive the 5 mindfulness training. And then that helps us to understand where you're coming from. And there is a wish also to receive a Dharma name, which is encouragement to reflect what your effort, what your direction into practicing the 5 mindfulness training. So you can opt not to receive a Dharma name if you want. In the form, there is a specific area when you say, I would like to receive a Dharma name, or I would not like to receive Dharma name. For many people also, you might receive a 5 mindfulness training, or we call it 5 Buddhist precept from another teacher before. So you could renew it by receiving the 5 mindfulness training from our Plum Village tradition. So it's just like you're learning French, you have a French teacher before, and now you have another French teacher. That's okay too. You know, you're not committing treason by switching Buddhist teacher or something like that. And also, if you receive one already and you already have a Dharma name, you can write the Dharma name on the application. You say, I just want to renew. I don't need another Dharma name. So some of the basic step in order to participate in a transmission ceremony on Saturday morning. So at this point, I would like to open the floor for anybody who would like to ask a question to the 5 panelists. And I think it's good to ask specific questions, so maybe I can apply to the... so if you could raise your hand, and I'm not sure we have enough microphone, we can pass around. Does the sound team have some extra microphone? There are 2 already. Okay.
Thank you. Good evening. My question is for you, Sue Ellen. In loving speech and deep listening, you know, your story is so tender. What?
Can you speak louder?
Yes. Is that better? Okay. About loving speech and deep listening, I get very confused about how to practice that while also, you know, setting healthy boundaries or protecting people who are disenfranchised, you know, openness, non-discrimination, non-attachment to transform violence, fanaticism, and dogmatism. So for me, the confusion sometimes is I think I'm practicing loving speech and deep listening, and what I'm also doing is like disappearing my own needs or my boundaries. I would be interested to hear anybody on the panel to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think tonight's presentation is around the ethics of it too, so I think your question is spot on, and I envision ethics of any sorts as consistently evolving, and it being kind of a lively kind of document. These mindfulness trainings have been changed over the years. I think one of the things that I didn't talk about in my presentation around my stance with my sister-in-law, that very different political viewpoint, and really supportive of kind of ideology that spews hate, is that in the loving speech piece and deep listening piece, I use that in that moment towards myself. How can I be with this? What serves the greater good? Am I willing in this point to kind of, not even use the word concede, because it's not about that. Like, how can I bring what's operative here is love into this? Whether it's deep listening or loving speech, how do I engage the power of love in this situation? And that's the best I can give you for the ethics in that. And in another situation with my family, it would entail speaking out. In another situation, I might choose to remain silent. But I think each of us really has to monitor at what price do we pay individually, given our own histories, for that silence. You know, is that going to cause less harm that we're witness to and brought into, despite really exquisite boundaries that we've worked years on establishing? I think in the moment it's really about that loving speech and that deep listening, also pointing it to yourself simultaneously. I think there was one Dharma talk where Tai posed the question, darling, how may I best love you? And I think that pertains to kind of loving speech and deep listening. So in that moment, myself, yourself, the darling, how may I best love myself in this moment?
Thank you for your question. As someone who's worked in social justice for a long time, and also in the office that investigated discrimination, I think it's important to ask the question around issues that could cause us rightful anger, right? When we see injustice, violence, war, there's times where we can have rage, right? As humans who have compassion, who see suffering and deeply feel for those who have been historically marginalized and persecuted. And part of my practice is not negating those feelings and saying those are bad feelings. It's more so, how do we channel those feelings? How do we transform that anger in a way that's not just mindful, but methodical? Because we do want to see change. And so the principle that I operate by in most of my work is called principled struggle, or being in right contradiction sometimes. And when we have an ethic that guides us, we can be in struggle with contradictory feelings, right? As long as we're principled about it. When we want to express rightful rage around something, allow that to process first, so you're not just reactionary, but you're being mindful and methodical, because ultimately, To create the change you want to see in the world, we have to be strategic about it as well. And so utilizing love is always going to be much more powerful than hateful speech. And so what I would invite you to do in moments like that, where you feel like your boundaries are being transgressed, or your values are being violated, you don't ignore that, you're not indifferent, you process that and find a way to communicate that principled struggled conversation and having those critical conversations with those folks, to still be able to call out and call in the folks who would need some transformation around those values and worldviews. So that's my offering to you. Hopefully that's been helpful.
I think there's a lady who raised her hand.
Dear Sangha, I want to ask a question about the first mindfulness relevance of life. So I recently had some house plants, and they're growing bugs. So, and I was also killing the bugs. I felt this moral struggle, like I am killing them, and I don't want them, and I ruthlessly get rid of them. But also, I'm engaging in an action of killing, and I'm struggling with that.
Dear Thầy, dear friends, I think all living beings would like to preserve their life. They have family, they have brother, sister, they have children, they have parents, they have mother, and so on. I think to me, the idea is to nourish our compassion. And like I mentioned, we'll never be perfect. I can mention some specific situation. Before the retreat in the Blue Cliff Monastery, which is about 3 weeks ago, we find out there are a couple of bees hive that are set near our lotus pond, which is where a lot of people walk by. And a couple of people being bitten by the bees. So we have to find a way how to evacuate the bee or invite them to leave. So we burn incense, we some chant, we invite them to leave. And then some friend also do a smoking, like burn something to flush it out. And then after a while, they leave to another place. And sometimes it's not always successful. Like we find out near the gate of the Blue Cliff Monastery, they have another family of wasps that are set there. And the wasps, as you know, can bite you many times, like, much more than the bees. And also we invite some friend to smoke them, and slowly when they leave the nest, we took the nest, we bring to the forest. And actually I found out some video clip, actually people who know well about the bees and the nest, they can really move the nest to a better surrounding. So like they build the beehive for the bees to work. Basically, the bee, they collect nectar, they collect honey for the young one, and they eat a little bit, but mostly to nourish the worker. But basically, the main thing is they nourish the young one, and usually the beekeepers who are well, they can compromise by not taking all the honey, but allow them to have a decent nest to raise their young, and also at the same time, we will borrow some extra honey so we can use it. And actually, a lot of bees are in danger of being killed because there are some killer bee, there's some other species, and also sometimes when you destroy the plant, the flower, and so on, there are less and less, and insecticide or different type. Sometimes they destroy a lot of colony of bees. So that's like specific for one thing. Another one, we have a few snake, and I think they're rat snake or something. And then almost every pond we have had a rat, and people were kind of afraid somehow, you know. But we try to educate them that there's a family of snake. So actually, there's a mother, there's a father, and some children, and they eat tadpole. They eat some frog. We don't know. They eat at night, so we don't know when they eat. But they don't eat everything. You know, they just eat when they need it. And then we build another pond, and another family of snake go there too. So sometimes, you know, you just have to learn how to live with them, you know. So we not be perfect in what we're practicing. And we have some rat sometime before too. And we have a kind of small rat trap that look like a margarine box or something like that. So they don't kill the rats. And after that, we can bring them far into the forest, we release them. And then we find out more because of our how you say, inadequacy. We take the food and we are not mindful, so we drop a lot of small grain of rice and little bits of, we don't clean the kitchen very often. So actually, to us, it's little breadcrumb, but actually to the rat, it's very big food. So by cleaning the kitchen on a regular basis, by shutting down the extra dripping water or something like that, to clean everything, so we create an environment when less debris, less food to be outside, so slowly they disappear. So basically, we are partly responsible for what the thing. The plant, sometimes we cut the lotus flower and those things. So we have a gata for that. You know, we like to borrow the lotus flower for the Buddha altar. So we communicate. We talk to the plant, the living beings, and so on, before we do it. Our respect for the life of it, you know. Thank you. Is that enough? Would you like to add something more?
I have a specific question about the 5th mindfulness training. There's something written that I just don't understand. It says the part about the 4 kinds of nutrients, edible foods and sense impressions. I get that, but what do we mean by volition and consciousness as a kind of nutrient?
Yeah, a fine question, and I, in several places, both in the Mindfulness Bell and in, actually probably on the Plum Village website, but Ty elaborates at length on the 4 nutriments, and I think Sister Annabelle does too. So the way I understand volition is its intention, and I gave the analogy of the sun's flesh, and with volition, and I might be mixing these up, but two strong men dragging another less strong man towards a kind of burning, say, pile of charcoal with the intention of throwing him onto it. And it's a metaphor for, the way I understand it, for our own volitions, harmful ones. And the teaching and the mindfulness, that mindfulness training are, you could say they're about codependent arising, which is how do we create conditions, favorable conditions for ourselves. So volition or intention is skillful. Consciousness, I'm going to leave to the brother because I've seen consciousness as being used three ways. One, just I'm aware of David sitting here talking with you, simple everyday meeting. Then there might be radiant consciousness of the unbound mind, and then just consciousness, it happens faster than we usually perceive, but it's just, there's a sound like this voice, there's recognition and awareness of that recognition, and that's flashing on and off. I don't quite know how it fits in this framework, but I believe that you do. Thank you.
I just want to leave you some opportunity to share too, but okay. I think for me, volition is like the deepest goal of your life. Like goals, like with S. And sometimes there might be some people who come from very poverty environment, and their wish is to be the richest man in the world, for example. And you can see some of the individuals who are super rich and still want to get more richer and so on, some people want to control other people's life, want to create more, like control all the software industry, all kind of thing. So to me, and you could have good volition too. You could have not so good volition, or you have, but what drives you? What drives you to in your life? And sometimes you can see some individual who accentuate that volition. Most of us has pretty much moderate volition. Volition to be a doctor, to care for other people. But I think there's some people who really drive a lot more into their volition. So that what from that point of view, that's why we use that word volition. Some people have a volition to revenge on somebody. I remember at that time in Vietnam, I think the volition is to have an independence in our country. And at that time, the French were invading our country, and then later on, it becomes something else, and then the American will be invading our country. So the idea of to have an independent of a country, you lose yourself by espousing a communist system of government in order to drive the invader out of the country. Then actually you losing your sense of direction, you lose your volition. So in the turn that Vietnam become a more authoritarian regime, so it's not as much independent and freedom for the people, for example. So that's some example. I think for consciousness, there are many ways of talking about consciousness. For me, it's probably easier to use Buddhist psychology. The Buddhist psychology divides into the 8 level of consciousness. So we have a consciousness of the 5 senses, like eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness. And on top of that, we also have mind consciousness. Whatever we put the idea in our mind, we call it mind consciousness. And then we have a ego consciousness, or the manas consciousness, is the idea of a self, the idea of protecting the self, the idea of selfishness, and that's driven from the formation of wrong ignorance of the reality that we are interconnected, and it becomes like a driving force in thinking about selfishness. So that we call ego consciousness or the manas consciousness. And at the bottom level is the storehouse consciousness or the subconsciousness, with encompassing almost everything. And this is the subconsciousness, even much larger than subconsciousness of Sigmund Freud or of Carl Jung. It's even larger. Basically, every experience that we experience through our life and our ancestor are all in there. So that many generations too. Everything is stored in that consciousness. And then, of course, you have individual consciousness and you have collective consciousness too. So when we talk about different things like that, we have to transform our consciousness is through those different level of consciousness. And mind you, they're all interconnected. The Buddhist psychology is just divided for the purpose of learning how to differentiate a certain thing. So let's say if you want to heal a certain thing, then you focus on the ego consciousness by transforming that. Or if you have a prejudice about hearing something, then you cleanse your ear, you focus on the ear consciousness to change the ear consciousness. But then deep down is also the mental consciousness that are one of the filter of the information from the 5 senses consciousness. So there's a whole book, Understand Our Mind. If you're interested, you can read that book. It talks a lot about those important information for that. Thank you. Anybody want to add something?
So, with the practice, you start paying attention to how you're thinking, what you're thinking, and I was kind of stunned and embarrassed at how often, just walking down the street, I'd have like negative thoughts about people, or a neighbor, just, oh, they don't seem like they're very friendly, or and then when I realized that, and then I had heard a talk suggest, I started practicing with friend I do not yet know. And so when some negative impression, comes to me about somebody that I actively turn it around to, oh, a friend that I do not yet know, or, like the person that cuts you off in traffic, and it's like, and turning it around, like, oh, well, they, have some emergency maybe that they had to get to, and, and so to me, I don't know, but that was how I took that.
dear Sangha. Rachel, this is for you. I'm also at a point in my life where I'm similarly experiencing, like, I don't love the gossip and I don't love talking about, like, what BMW you just got and your next house and all of that. And I noted that you said, like, when you feel strong, you can see what you love about those people and sort of deal with it skillfully. How do you deal with it when you maybe don't feel as strong and grounded? I'm really, really interested, or from anyone, but especially from you. Thank you.
Dear beloved Sangha, we also receive a question from one of our friends who are joining us online right now. So if possible, I could also read this question. And if any one of you feel inspired to share, that would be wonderful. What would you recommend when you watch or witness kids playing around with the word kill, toy guns, war games? It seems like this is built into their play, especially boys. This always gets me. I notice it, but I don't say anything. Thank you.
Before we answer, I think I just want to let the sound team know that this microphone has a red light. That means the battery is depleting.
I'll address the first question. What I'm learning is when I'm not feeling solid, that I take myself out of the situation. So in that situation around being, I just minimized how much I was in contact with those people. And yeah, I have one friend who is a very old dear friend, and she has a lot of suffering. And I felt like every time we would see each other that it was very one-sided, and that I was just kind of listening and absorbing, and it felt overwhelming. And so I did kind of, put off getting together. But then another thing that I did was I got together with her at gardens, where we could be, I could sort of be a little more skillful and distracting, like, oh, isn't that beautiful, and just bring the conversation into other things, yeah.
Yeah, I think what you said was sort of what I was going to get at is, I've seen this happen over like meals, or, if you're in a social situation. So I would actually also redirect, hey, this food is great. I would actually even say that, and I was reading somewhere, like, this is not in as much as distraction, but rather bringing them to the present. So it's, like you said, a skillful way, but I think also reminds us to, I think, being in the present moment, and you can also help others see that. Of course, it's not always successful, but as we have been told that we don't need to be perfect.
So I would like to ask if any of the panelists up there have any experience with the question that was posed from one of our friends joining us online about seeing your kids using the word like kill, playing games, war games, toy guns, and especially boys, how this is part of their play. And sometimes this person see it, but they don't say anything. So if you have any experience with this, please share with us.
So I am a mom, and I have a 9-year-old who loves to play Roblox. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Roblox. And part of the game has like murder mystery and killing and violence. And she's not a boy, but I understand the repercussions and the social conditioning that we teach our boys in this society. And it's a struggle, I think, as parents or as people who are around children. We have to extend the same level of conscious consuming and compassion towards them. And for me, I think it's about understanding the landscape, that there will be exposures to things that we do not agree with in society. At school and elsewhere, there's going to be peer pressure where we can exert influence and, set some controls on those iPads, and making sure there's age-appropriate content. The same way we want to be conscious about our own consumerism, we have to make sure they are protected too. And when you observe that it's going towards a place that feels unhealthy or toxic, I think it's okay to have those conversations. I think children have a deeper capacity for understanding than we sometimes assume. Here we have great teachers, sisters and brothers, in programming to teach them mindfulness, to teach them reverence for life. And they absorb it all. They know how to understand these concepts. And so, be courageous in your conversations with them around what can be harmful behaviors and what can lead to violent ways of thinking. And my daughter's come to some retreats here, family retreats, and has really learned from a lot of the principles here from the trainings. And so just being able to challenge your children to really understand some of the ways they engage in these games can lead to more harmful reflections and manifestations. And I think they will be up to the task to be able to live up to the values that we want to reflect and teach in them.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't have that perspective as a parent, but I teach a course on nonviolence. It certainly doesn't make me an expert teaching it, but I think in those most immediate situations where you want to try to take some action or feel like you want to be part of the solution and not the problem, and when you're witnessing, is to, it's hard, but to remain curious, especially with young people, and ask the questions of why are you doing that, or not in that accusatory way, like you're doing something wrong, but truly out of curiosity. Because what we're seeing in that enactment is we're seeing a reification of gender binaries, and what is that about? How does that come about? We're also seeing the end pieces or the beginning pieces of militarism, and that's a huge system, particularly in the United States. And oftentimes, it's not a secret, is that oftentimes the military will go into communities of color to do recruitment outside. One of our neighborhoods in Chicago is one of the largest recruitment sectors. So I think any minor, what you might consider minor attention or action to these situations that you're witnessing is one step to righting the wrongs of violence and militarism. And I think the best way is to, in that moment, is to remain curious, because you don't know. It may have been like, my uncle gave me this toy gun and I love my uncle. You don't know what that's about. Yeah, it's not easy. But I also think that if you can engage young people in conversations, if you have any knowledge of alternatives where people are doing things, where that sense of fantasy and play, but also engagement is being used towards something good, whether it's climate, becoming a climate warrior, or offering those kinds of alternatives. If you can get in conversation, I think the first thing is to get in conversation and be curious, and to, as best we can, withhold any judgment or whatever's arising in us that is kind of recoiling and repelling against. We're seeing the witnessing of violence played out. So.
Yeah, just I have two sons, but they're a bit older, in their early 30s, late 20s, so getting into video games, but the world wasn't quite the same then. I just wanted to support, one, the self-awareness that sometimes comes at a different pace. I remember one of my sons sort of saying, yeah, I do feel bad or irritable after I do this game. The other piece, so this is more for parents really than why as a society this is what we would like to produce and do it so well actually, that even if one dabbles, because we've never played them, Climate Warrior, you know, it's somehow, I guess it's the flow of money, so the games themselves are quite sophisticated, but what I think is it's helpful to actually talk to other parents, which isn't necessarily always easy, on simple things like what are people's policies or agreements or disagreements. And the other one, and maybe it doesn't fit today, but I never expected my child to like me all the time. And they had very little exposure. In those days, it would be more to television and to video, you know, like watch a video, until they started school. And then, you know, it's a mix of, you got to be out there in the world and be with your friends, and, or, you know, grandpa can be grandpa, and maybe watch something that we wouldn't. But this might be a bias of mine, but I guess although friendship is in parenting, I don't think the job of a parent is to be friends all the time, or to not be willing to tolerate the difficulty of setting a standard or practicing what we preach, which maybe is tougher, or doing other things. And for individual children, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer here, and it's not a straight line from the video games to a violent person. My nephew is a guy who spends 35 hours a week doing that and the other 40 hours working. And his father finally got worried about it in his late 20s, but he's never hurt a fly. It's just a sad way to live. That's all.
Okay, thank you, friend. I think we are about over the time. Maybe one last question, if possible, yeah, and then we end. This would be the last question, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tai and the Sangha. Rachel, you mentioned something, but I'm not going to direct the question at you. I'm going to direct it to everyone. On our early path to enlightenment, when we see suffering in someone, how do you prevent judgment and superiority in the oh, bless their hearts, they're in this phase, and knowing that we're all connected and their suffering is our suffering. What advice might you have to us early on the path that can prevent that from happening?
Well, for me, I've gotten a lot of humility from this because I see, usually when I see something in somebody else that I'm critical of, if I really look at it, it's something deep in me that I'm critical of and that I'm unhappy about. But I'm going to pass this along to somebody.
I think that every day with this practice, knowing that things are always changing, it humbles me to life. Just when you thought it was going to be this, it's that, and you didn't count on that. I do a little trick with myself. Sometimes when I'm riding the bus and I'm looking at somebody like myself or older, and I'm looking at their faces become rounder, lose kind of the sharp features. I like looking at people and thinking, wow, what did they look like as a baby? What did their face look like? And despite how they might be sitting or how they might appear to be worn down by life, somebody somewhere at some time was absolutely delighted that they came into the world and that they still have that inside of them. It's a little trick I play with myself, but the idea is that things are always changing. And even my perceptions of people, when I have that like immediate hit, like, oh, this person is that or this, and somatically I'm trying to trust that, and sometimes I'm wrong. And that's humbling too, because my sensory experience of the world has been trained by the world too. So I think the fact that things are always changing, which to me is somewhat the heart of the practice. Thank you.
I guess we're going to all speak. I'm just reminded by the concept of suffering, and the suffering of others is not separate from my own. And we are all interconnected truly. And the notion of interbeing means that we are not above or superior to someone who's currently suffering, because we have suffered too and will suffer as well, as we are all human, and that's part of the journey. And so understanding that there is no hierarchy, there's no comparison around who suffers more or less, and understanding true empathy to another person's conditions is a practice of compassion. And when you have that compassion, it becomes egalitarian. You're no longer on a scale, right? And I think that's the practice, being able to understand that their humanity and their suffering is my own as well. And that's how I would view that. And it's difficult. I mean, especially lately in my personal life, somebody who is suffering immensely has hurt me immensely. And I have to contend with that and contend with my compassion and my empathy, and not try to do this valuing or moralizing of another human being's worth compared to mine. And I think it takes practice and commitment to true compassion for yourself as well. So that's where I stand when it comes to that question. Thank you.
I guess since you said all of us are speaking, so we'll all speak. I I guess suffering, I think of it two ways. Not trying to create new categories here, but one is that comes from those 5 remembrances, or forgetting those remembrances. I see that a lot day to day in my own work. And I think the question really is, would we be able to connect better with the suffering if we ourselves have suffered? I think all of us have suffered one way or the other. That's the first noble truth. So I think if you look deep within, you'll recognize your own suffering. And the more I have recognized on the path, the more that I have recognized my own suffering, it has made it much easier to connect with people who I may not agree with. And to your point, the other kind of suffering is when we see somebody who is saying something and, part of us thinks that, oh yeah, we are now, black belt mindful person, or, we are way ahead of the game. But I think at that time, having compassion and realizing that whatever someone says is not them, that's not who they are. That's what they're saying, or what they view at that moment is. And just recognizing what could have led them to be that way. And I think in order to do that, we all have to look deep within at our own roots of suffering. That makes it, at least for me, makes it much, much easier to not have that sense of superiority. Because I think at the end we are all suffering. That's the human condition. We are learning how to, not suffer more. Thank you.
So, dear Thai, dear friends, I'm aware that the time is over, and we like to wrap up this evening. But by no means you can continue the conversation and the question into your own Dharma sharing family. So all the question that has not been answered or has not been raised, please bring it to your Dharma sharing family. And also Saturday morning, we also have a session of question and answer. So you can bring this question also there. So I would like to thank all the 5 panelists for bravely come up here and share about their practice, understanding, as well as answer all the questions being raised. So I would like to wrap up and end up this session by listening to 3 sounds of the bell, and after that there might be some more instruction later. Thank you.